He sat at the defense table and smirked, sliding a forged forensic accounting report toward the judge that effectively left me with nothing. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I simply unclasped the lock on the black leather folder I had been meticulously filling for 36 months. 45 minutes later, his entire world collapsed and he never saw it coming. My name is Clara. For 7 years, I was married to Mark, a man who possessed the kind of charm that could disarm a hostile witness and drain a shared bank account with equal ease. Mark was an investment banker, but his true profession was reality manipulation. He belonged to a family that treated wealth not as a tool, but as a weapon to keep outsiders in line. And from the day I married him, I was the ultimate outsider. Mark's mother, Eleanor, was the architect of this dynamic. She was a woman who never raised her voice because she never had to. Her whispers did enough damage. The family operated on a simple, unspoken rule. Mark was the golden child, incapable of error, and any failure or friction in our marriage was inherently my fault. I remember one Thanksgiving, 3 years into the marriage. I had spent 2 days preparing a traditional meal, meticulously following his grandmother's recipes. When Eleanor arrived, she took one look at the dining table, smiled thinly, and whispered that it was so brave of me to attempt this, because Mark always preferred women with ambit, ion over domestic competence. Mark laughed, a loud, booming laugh that echoed off the vaulted ceilings of our colonial home. I swallowed the humiliation, smiled back, and served the turkey. That was my role, the punching bag dressed in pearls. The financial abuse didn't start with a bang. It started with a whisper. He would kiss my forehead after a long day at my architecture firm and tell me to let him handle the complex accounts. He said I was so creative, I shouldn't have to worry about the boring numbers. It sounded like love. It felt like care. It was actually the construction of a cage. Slowly, my name disappeared from the primary investment portfolios. Then the deed to the summer house we bought together. Then the joint savings. Every time I asked a question, I was met with that signature blend of patronizing patience and subtle irritation. He would tell me he was securing our future and ask if I trusted him. Every time I tried to bring up our finances, he deployed a psychological countermeasure. He would ask why I was always so obsessed with money, pouring himself a scotch with steady hands. He would say it was very unbecoming and remind me that his mother had warned him I might have gold digger tendencies, but he had defended me. The sheer audacity of it was paralyzing. He was robbing me blind while accusing me of greed. That was his favorite tactic. Gaslighting, so refined it felt like a clinical diagnosis. He convinced our friends, his family, and eventually me, that I was emotionally fragile. The narrative of the unstable wife was meticulously seated at dinner parties and country club gatherings. He would gently touch my arm when I spoke too passionately about a design project, giving the table a knowing, tragic look that silently communicated a plea for patience with my suit. He posed instability. I started to believe it. I started shrinking. I stopped wearing bright colors. I stopped speaking up. I became a ghost in my own life, haunting the pristine hallways of our home, wondering if I really was as difficult, as demanding, and as deeply flawed as Mark insisted. I trusted him until the day I found the first discrepancy. It was a Tuesday. I was looking for a tax document in his home office and stumbled upon a bank statement from an institution we supposedly didn't use. A monthly withdrawal of $4,000, categorized under a vague consulting fee, funneling out to an LLC I had never heard of. When I confronted him, he didn't apologize. He didn't even look up from his laptop. He just sighed, that heavy, victimized sigh he had perfected, and said it was a high-yield aggressive growth fund. He told me that if I understood basic economics, he wouldn't have to hide the paperwork to prevent my anxiety attacks. I hired a private investigator not to track his movements, but to track the routing numbers. The paper trail was astonishing. He hadn't just opened an LLC. He had systematically forged my signature on documents that transferred my premarital assets, money my late father had left me, into an offshore trust controlled entirely by his He was effectively laundering my inheritance. The real betrayal, however, the core fracture, wasn't just the hidden money or the emotional starvation. It was the discovery that he was funding a parallel life. The LLC wasn't a growth fund. It was a lease on a penthouse apartment across town, an apartment occupied by a 26-year-old paralegal named Sarah, who wore my favorite perfume, the one Mark bought for her using the credit card tied to my architecture firm's business account. I found the receipts. I found the leasing agreement. I found the email chains where he referred to me as the anchor dragging him down. My blood ran cold. The room went dead silent. Any normal person would have screamed. They would have thrown his golf clubs onto the lawn, burned his bespoke suits, or called a divorce lawyer that very afternoon in a fit of hysterical rage. But standing there, holding the printed proof of my 7-year humiliation, I didn't feel rage. I felt a sudden, freezing clarity. If I confronted him then, he would spin it. He would hide the assets deeper. His family would activate their legal machine, and I would be left completely destitute, forever branded the unstable wife who ruined a perfect marriage. I couldn't just leave. I had to dismantle him. If you are listening to this and something feels familiar, if you have been trapped in a system designed to make you feel like you're losing your mind, let me tell you something, CR. You shall. The peace you think you are keeping is destroying you. Keeping the peace is just a polite name for slow self-destruction. Narcissistic systems, whether it's a spouse, a boss, or an entire family, rely entirely on your willingness to internalize their dysfunction. They use your empathy as a weapon against you. You feel guilt for questioning them, while they feel absolutely no shame in betraying you. Guilt is feeling bad about what you did. Shame is feeling bad about who you are. They project their shame onto you, forcing you to carry it so they don't have to. If you are exhausted from constantly translating someone else's disrespect into your own character flaw, you need to stop. Stop explaining. Stop translating. Start documenting. The moment you stop reacting emotionally is the moment you take your power back. That was the day I stopped being his wife and became his auditor. What I didn't know yet was that the penthouse lease was just a breadcrumb, and the real secret he was hiding would almost cost me my freedom. What I've told you so far is how they broke me down. What comes next is how I built back differently. 3 weeks passed. Then everything accelerated. I stopped crying in the shower. I stopped arguing when Mark called me crazy or told me I was imagining his late nights at the office. Instead, I agreed with him. I played the exact part he had written for me. I became docile, distracted, the perfect picture of the fragile, overwhelmed wife. It was the only way to operate invisibly. My architecture firm became my sanctuary, the only place I still felt like myself. While he thought I was struggling to draft floor plans and match paint swatches, I was actually drafting his financial autopsy. The emotional temperature in my chest dropped to absolute zero. I didn't feel rage anymore. I felt like a machine. I opened a separate bank account at a small credit union 3 towns over, depositing small amounts of cash I withdrew during grocery runs. I bought a prepaid burner phone with cash and kept it locked inside the heavy steel safe in my office, right next to the original blueprints of my father's house. I hired a forensic accountant who specialized in high-net-worth divorces and corporate fraud. Her name was Diane. Diane didn't deal in emotions, sympathy, or tears. She dealt in ledgers, routing numbers, and cold, hard facts. Diane was the one who found the bottom of the rabbit hole. Mark wasn't just paying for Sarah's penthouse out of a secret checking account. He was heavily leveraged, teetering on the edge of personal bankruptcy. His glittering investment banking career was a facade built on massive, compounding debt. But the most horrifying discovery was how he was keeping himself afloat. He had taken out a secondary, massive mortgage on my architecture firm's commercial building at a prime piece of real estate my father bought in the late 90s using a forged power of attorney. The audacity of it was breathtaking. He had convinced a notary, an old country club friend of his mother's, to stamp and validate the document without my physical presence or consent. If you are listening to this right now and you think a shared life means shared blind trust, you are playing a dangerous game with your future. A document signed before conflict is basic self-preservation. A paper trail is not paranoia, it is your ultimate defense. Financial abuse is still abuse, and unlike emotional manipulation, it leaves a concrete, undeniable footprint. You need to gather bank statements, tax returns, and property deeds before you ever mention the word divorce. If you wait until the battle starts to find your weapons, the armory will already be locked and guarded. Build your paper trail quietly, systematically, and without a drop of emotion. Secure the documents while they still think you are asleep. Diane didn't stop there. She followed the money Mark had siphoned from my premarital inheritance. It didn't just go to an offshore account. It went into a trust controlled by Eleanor, his mother. But Eleanor wasn't just holding it for safekeeping. She was actively laundering it. She funneled the money into a shell corporation registered in Delaware, and then quietly gifted it back to Mark as early inheritance deposits. Legally, under our state's laws, inheritances and gifts received during a marriage are considered separate property, not subject to division in a divorce. They were systematically converting my personal wealth into his untouchable assets. What I'm about to tell you is the part I almost left out, but you need to hear it. He crossed the final, unforgivable line on my 34th birthday. Mark threw a lavish, catered dinner party at our home to celebrate. Eleanor was there, of course, wearing her signature string of pearls and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. In front of 20 guests, she stood up and gifted me a self-help book on managing emotional volatility and hormonal imbalances. The table chuckled politely. Mark kissed my cheek, wrapped his arm around my waist, and gave a little speech about how much he loved standing by me despite my ongoing psychological challenges. I kept my voice steady. I smiled, thanked her for her concern, and took a sip of my sparkling water. My blood ran cold, but my hands didn't shake. I was floating above my own body. Later that evening, while Mark was pouring vintage wine for his colleagues in the living room, his phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. He had left it unlocked, careless and entirely secure in his belief that I would never dare snoop. I walked over to the island to get more ice for the cocktail shaker. I didn't go searching for anything. The notification popped up right there on the illuminated screen, bright and unavoidable. It was an email from Sarah. The subject line read, "Urgent clinic." The preview text was right there. The clinic called. "I'm pregnant. We need the rest of the trust money now, Mark. I'm not waiting anymore." I stood in the ambient glow of the under-cabinet lighting and read those 3 sentences over and over again. He wasn't just replacing me with a younger version. He was funding his new family, his new child, with the inheritance my dead father had left me. He was using the legacy of the man who loved me to build a life with a woman who was actively helping him destroy me. Mark walked into the kitchen right as the screen faded to black. He asked if I was okay, giving me that practiced look of patronizing concern. I let out a short, humorless laugh, pretending to be amused by a joke I had just heard in the dining room. I handed him the silver ice bucket. I didn't confront him. I didn't throw the ice water in his face. I simply walked back to the party and played the perfect hostess until the very last guest left our driveway. That night, after the wine wore off and Mark fell into a heavy, snoring sleep, I didn't go to bed. I walked into his home office. I didn't turn on the overhead lights. I used the small pen light I kept on my keychain. I knew he kept a secondary, locked briefcase in the bottom drawer of his filing cabinet. He told me it was just old client files, strictly confidential. But Diane had warned me that men like Mark always keep a physical backup of their most sensitive sins. They are too narcissistic to completely destroy the proof of how clever they are. I had spent the last 2 weeks secretly borrowing the key from his valet tray while he showered, getting a duplicate cut at a hardware store 2 towns over. I slid the new brass key into the lock. It turned with a satisfying click. What I found inside that folder changed everything I thought I knew about the past 7 years. I stood in his dark office, the only light coming from the harsh white glow of my phone screen. The briefcase didn't just hold the LLC formation documents. It was a perfectly organized archive of my systematic destruction. There were printed emails between Mark and Eleanor dated over 3 years ago, discussing the specific legal loopholes required to bypass the notary signature on my commercial Buick. Elding. Eleanor had written, verbatim, "Clara won't notice. She's too distracted drawing pretty houses." My phone battery was flashing red at 12%. My hands were slick with cold sweat as I photographed every single page. The camera shutter sound turned off, so I wouldn't wake him. The lighting was terrible, and the glare from the glossy paper forced me to retake several shots, wasting precious minutes. At one point, the floorboards in the hallway creaked. I froze, my heart slamming against my ribs, ready to close the drawer and play the sleepwalker. But it was just the house settling. I finished taking 64 photographs. I put everything exactly back where I found it, down to the precise angle of the folders, relocked the drawer, and slid the key back into his valet tray on his nightstand. During the next 3 days, playing the part of the oblivious wife was the hardest acting job of my life. He would come home from networking events smelling of Sarah's perfume, and I would politely heat up his dinner and ask about his day. He would pat my hand and tell me I looked exhausted, suggesting I double my therapy sessions to help manage my irrational moods. Every time he gaslighted me, every time he used his manufactured concern as a weapon, I didn't argue. I just silently added another line item to Diane's spreadsheet in my mind. I let him build his false sense of security until it was practically a fortress. He was so blinded by his own narcissism that he didn't realize I had completely stopped crying. He mistook my strategic silence for submission. For 5 years, I absorbed everything quietly. That ends here. Mark filed the divorce petition that Friday. He tried to frame it as a compassionate separation, citing my erratic behavior in the initial filings to preemptively control the narrative. He requested an early mediation hearing, completely confident he could bully me into a quick settlement before the discovery phase of a trial could unearth his financial maze. The mediation took place on a rainy Thursday in a high-rise downtown. Mark arrived flanked by his expensive, aggressively cologne-scented lawyer and, predictably, Eleanor. She sat slightly behind him, the puppeteer disguised as a supportive mother, holding a leather-bound notebook. Mark wore his bespoke navy suit, the one he always wore when closing major bank mergers. He looked relaxed, checking his luxury watch, almost bored by the inconvenience of discarding me. He genuinely thought I was showing up unrepresented, too emotionally paralyzed to retain counsel. When I walked into that cold, glass-walled conference room, I wasn't alone. I walked in with Diane, my forensic accountant, and Richard, a senior litigator whose reputation for ruthlessness in financial fraud cases was legendary in our city. Mark's lawyer barely glanced at them, assuming they were just junior associates I had managed to scrape together. Mark's lawyer opened the session with a deeply patronizing speech. He steepled his fingers, sighed heavily, and slid a single sheet of paper across the table. Mark looked at me with that practiced, tragic expression, offering a $50,000 settlement to walk away cleanly. He stated, for the record, that it was a remarkably generous offer given the massive debts I had supposedly accrued on my business properties, and that he was doing this purely out of respect for the good years we shared. I didn't look at him. I looked at the mediator. I kept my voice steady. "We reject the settlement," I said calmly, "and we are instead submitting exhibits A through F." I slid the thick, black leather folder across the mahogany table. I unclasped the lock with a sharp, metallic click. I pulled out the 300-page forensic accounting report, the higher-resolution photographs of the forged power of attorney, the bank routing numbers tracking the stolen inheritance, and finally, a printed copy of the email confirming Sarah's pregnancy. Mark reached for the top document. His smug, relaxed smile froze perfectly in place. I watched him closely as he read the first page, and then the second. The blood rapidly drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, pale gray. His eyes darted frantically across the columns of exposed routing numbers, searching for an escape hatch that didn't exist. His hands, usually so steady and confident when pouring his evening scotch, began to tremble violently, rattling the heavy paper against the wood. He opened his mouth, desperately trying to formulate his signature gaslighting response, but his vocal cords completely failed him. The room went dead silent. The mediator adjusted his glasses, staring in sheer disbelief at the concrete evidence of federal wire fraud, while Eleanor sat perfectly rigid, her pearls suddenly looking like a choke chain around her neck. I leaned forward, looking directly into Mark's panicked eyes and smiled. "You should have burned the briefcase, Mark." Watching them freeze in that conference room, the absolute truth about relationship dynamics finally clicked into place. Boundaries are simply a description of what you will and will not accept. Enforcing them is not cruelty, it is absolute clarity. People who scream the loudest about loyalty and family preservation are almost always the ones who have done the absolute least to earn it. You cannot reason with someone who actively benefits from misunderstanding you. Leaving quietly, legally, and permanently is the most powerful thing you can do. I didn't need to yell at Mark to prove my sanity. I just needed the black ink on the white paper to do the talking. I thought the mediation room would be the definitive end of the war. I didn't know it then, but that Thursday was just the demolition phase. What happened over the next 48 hours exposed a level of desperation I never thought they were capable of. I thought the worst was behind me. I was wrong because a cornered narcissist, stripped of their narrative control, is the most dangerous version of themselves. Mark and his lawyer immediately requested a recess, frantically trying to regroup in the hallway. But Richard, my litigator, had already filed an emergency ex parte motion for a temporary restraining order on all financial assets, including the offshore trust and the Delaware LLC. The filing was strategic, designed to freeze everything before Eleanor could wire the funds out of the country. It wasn't entirely smooth. The court clerk system went offline for 20 agonizing minutes just as Richard hit submit. I sat in the lobby, watching the clock tick, terrified that Eleanor was on her phone in the elevator, transferring the remainder of my father's money to an unreachable account in T. He came in islands, but the system rebooted. The judge signed the order, and by 3 p.m, every single account connected to Mark and his mother was completely locked down by federal order. Mark's unraveling was spectacular because it was so public. Once the forensic accounting report was officially entered into the court record as part of the financial injunction, it became discoverable. Richard didn't have to leak anything. He just let the legal process run its natural course. The compliance department at Mark's investment bank ran routine checks on civil litigation involving their senior executives. When they saw the documented proof of a forged power of attorney and federal wire fraud, they didn't ask him for an explanation. They didn't care about his charm. They terminated his employment immediately. They escorted the golden boy out of the glass building with his personal belongings in a single cardboard box, flanked by building security. Then came the collapse of his parallel life. Sarah, the paralegal carrying his child, had been promised the penthouse, the country club lifestyle, and a steady stream of trust fund money. When the bank accounts froze, the rent on the penthouse bounced. Mark had to confess that not only was the money gone, but he was facing massive civil liabilities and potential criminal charges. Sarah didn't stick around to play the supportive partner. She packed her bags, broke the lease, and moved back to her parents' house in a different state, leaving Mark completely alone. He had burned down his marriage to fund a fantasy, and the fantasy evaporated the moment the funding stopped. The smear campaign they had, so carefully constructed against me, reversed direction with brutal speed. You see, society loves a gossip, but it respects a paper trail. When our mutual friends, the ones who had given me those patronizing looks of pity for years, found out that Mark had stolen my inheritance to buy a penthouse for his pregnant miss, the silence was deafening. The phone calls started pouring in, people apologizing, claiming they never really believed Mark, saying they always knew something was off. I didn't answer a single one of those calls. I didn't need their retroactive loyalty. I packed my bags, moved out of the colonial house, and rented a beautiful, minimalist apartment downtown, entirely funded by my own firm's legitimate profits. But Eleanor wasn't done yet. A week after the assets were frozen, she called my burner phone. I don't know how she got the number, but when I answered, her voice was dripping with that same venomous, aristocratic politeness. She offered me a deal. If I withdrew the fraud allegations, she would personally write me a check for the amount Mark had taken, plus a generosity fee. She framed it as saving the family name from public disgrace. She still thought she could buy her way out of reality. I kept my voice steady. I told her I didn't want her check, because the court was going to award me the assets anyway, along with punitive damages. And then I hung up. I didn't block her number, I just never answered it again. Letting it ring became a daily reminder of my own peace. Mark, completely out of options, cornered, and facing potential prison time for wire fraud, did the one thing a golden child is never supposed to do. He turned on his mother. During his deposition, desperate to avoid a federal indictment, he testified under oath that Eleanor was the mastermind behind the trust fund manipulation. He claimed she had coerced him into moving the money, leveraging his debt to force his compliance. The loyalty they had weaponized against me entirely imploded. Eleanor was formally subpoenaed the very next day. The woman who had spent her entire life pulling strings from the shadows was suddenly dragged into the harsh, fluorescent lighting of a federal courtroom, betrayed by the very son she had programmed to be a monster. Watching them tear each other apart in the legal system was like watching a snake eat its own tail. I didn't have to lift another finger. I sat in the back of the courtroom during those preliminary hearings, taking quiet notes on my iPad. I didn't gloat. I didn't smirk at them across the aisle. I just wore my favorite navy suit, drank my coffee, and watched the expensive lawyers they hired systematically dismantle their family dynamic to save their respective clients. The legal proceedings dragged on for 11 brutal months, a slow, agonizing bleed of their resources. The colonial house went into foreclosure because Mark couldn't pay the mortgage without my income. It was eventually sold at a public auction. But the absolute worst consequence for Mark wasn't losing his house, his career, or his parallel life. It was the final ruling handed down by the federal judge regarding the stolen inheritance. Because while Mark thought he was just facing a massive civil penalty, the judge looked at the meticulously documented forged signatures and decided that a fine wasn't going to be enough. What the judge decreed next made the entire courtroom gasp. The judge didn't just order the immediate return of my stolen funds. He set down his pen, folded his hands, and looked directly at Mark's attorney. He stated, for the official court record, that given the magnitude of the forged documents, the crossing of state lines via the Delaware LLC, and the clear evidence of premeditatio, and he was legally obligated to pause the civil proceedings. He was referring the entire case file directly to the United States Attorney's Office for Federal Criminal Prosecution. The color drained from Mark's face so fast I thought he was going to pass out. The arrogance he had worn like a bespoke suit for 7 years shattered into a million invisible pieces on the polished courtroom floor. He had walked into that building expecting to pay a minor civil penalty, sign a non-disclosure agreement, and buy his way out of a mistake. Instead, he walked out facing a massive federal indictment for wire fraud and identity theft. The criminal trial was remarkably swift because the paper trail was absolute. There was no psychological defense against 64 high-resolution photographs of his own handwritten notes, signed ledgers, and bank routing numbers. Mark eventually accepted a plea deal to avoid a potential 10-year sentence. He was sentenced to 36 months in a minimum security federal correctional facility. More importantly, he was ordered to pay full restitution, and he was permanently barred by the SEC from ever holding a license in the financial sector again. The glittering career he had used to justify his superiority was completely, irrevocably dead. Eleanor's downfall was quieter, but perhaps even more devastating for a woman whose entire identity was anchored to her perceived social supremacy. She desperately tried to distance herself from Mark, testifying that she was an unwitting participant in his complex financial schemes. But the printed emails I had pulled from that locked briefcase, the ones where she explicitly mocked my intelligence and detailed the money laundering strategy, were entered into federal evidence. To avoid joining her golden child in federal prison, she was forced into a crippling financial settlement with both the IRS and the civil court. She had to liquidate the massive family estate, sell off her prize stock portfolios, and forfeit every penny in the offshore accounts. The woman who used to whisper cruelties across a sprawling, catered Thanksgiving table now lives in a modest, two-bedroom condo on the unfashionable outskirts of the city. Her prestigious country club quietly revoked her membership, citing the unfortunate public nature of the family's legal troubles. Her elite circle of friends, the very people she had endlessly entertained with fabricated stories of my supposed mental instability, completely abandoned her. She is now entirely isolated, left alone with the reality of what she built. As for me, the court restored full, unencumbered ownership of my commercial building. I forced the immediate sale of our colonial home, and because of the extensive financial damages awarded by the judge, I walked away with 100% of the equity. I took that money, packed up my architecture firm, and moved 3 states away to a city where no one knew my past. I bought a rugged piece of land overlooking a quiet, Gray Bay, and I designed my own house from the ground up. I built a beautiful, peaceful life with a foundation that no one else has the keys to. I want to tell you one last thing about leaving a toxic system. When I finally cut ties, I didn't send a long, explanatory email. I didn't ask for a final closure meeting. I simply went no contact. No contact is not a dramatic punishment. It is a medical decision. It is the surgical removal of a cancer from your daily life. You do not owe an explanation to the people who actively benefit from misunderstanding you. It has been 2 years since that final gavel fell, and sitting here in my new home, looking out at the water, my perspective has completely shifted. What do I know now that I didn't know before this happened? I know that true closure does not come from an apology. For a long time, I thought I needed Mark to look me in the eye and admit what he did. I thought I needed Eleanor to confess her cruelty. I didn't. Waiting for a narcissist to apologize is just another way of keeping yourself chained to their distorted reality. True closure comes from making them completely irrelevant to your future. You do not have to forgive them to be free. You just have to outgrow them, legally outmaneuver them, and walk away into a life they cannot possibly touch. The hardest part of the betrayal wasn't losing the money, it was losing my trust in my own mind. But getting it back, realizing that my intuition was fiercely accurate all along, was the most profound victory of all. But the real question is, how long will you let them write your story before you finally pick up the pen? So what do you think? Did I go too far or not far enough? Let me know in the comments below.